meant to defend against Russian advancement. In other words, NATO.
Russia is demanding that NATO should stop expanding eastward.
Presidents of Albania and Croatia joined
NATO threatening Russian security.
Developing countries response to NATO's expansion.
Finland and Sweden.
Leaders of the country formally announced their intention to join NATO.
Russia's land border with NATO doubling in length.
For decades now, Russia and NATO have danced around each other, trying to seek peaceful resolutions. And now, Russia has woken up to the harsh reality of NATO's strength, a power they can no longer afford to ignore.
Dalawang taon na si Patrick
Russia
Soyan,
is so
baka sa
scared
TV
of
show.
NATO's advancements that this year, they went to war with Ukraine over the country's decision to apply for NATO membership. Imagine that. Attacking an independent democracy over the fear of what if. So now, let's take a look into what NATO really is and why Russia seems so terrified of them. So we're going to be going pretty in-depth with this video, and as the YouTube
Eugene,
algorithm
Piano Pascual, Pati Masiano, and Wayan Kerebyaba from album Song for Peace from
To
Robert
understand
Kurtz.
why Putin fears this alliance, it's essential that we thoroughly define what NATO is and why it exists. We're going to have to go way back for this one. So let's take a trip through history, shall we? You see, after the Second World War, the war that lasted between 1939 and 1945, the Soviet Union refused to withdraw forces from Eastern Europe. Maybe it was anger from the severe losses the Soviet Union experienced during the war, or maybe it was greed in an attempt to secure more resources. Whatever the reason, they didn't withdraw. In 1948, they then encircled Berlin, Germany's capital. This forced the other world superpower, the United States, to take action in a bid to halt the advances of the Soviet Union. In this attempt to counter Soviet expansionism, NATO was founded in 1949. That was the birth of what is now Moscow's nightmare. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and when it was formed, it had 12 member countries. This included, apart from the US, Britain, France, Canada, Italy, the Netherlands, Iceland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, Portugal, and Denmark. Yes, I know, they are all heavy hitters. Today, however, NATO has 30 member countries, and it is more powerful than it has ever been. The newest member state is North Macedonia, which joined in 2020. There are also 3 so-called partner countries, that is Ukraine, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, that have all declared their aspirations to become part of the alliance. This will only increase the resources and the strength of the alliance. However, this declaration of intent is part of the reason why Russian discontent exists. I'll talk about that in a moment. In essence, NATO is a military alliance, created to act as a common security policy for all member states. What I mean by that is that if a NATO member country is invaded, this will be considered an invasion of all NATO member countries. An attack on one is an attack on all. Therefore, all NATO member countries will act against the invasion. You know the drill. It's much like brothers do on the playground. NATO says its purpose is to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through political and military means. This is the key statement in the NATO Pact, and it is the reason that Russia is so afraid of NATO. And this is the part specifically where Russian fear kicks in. When the Soviet Union collapsed on December 25th, 1991, about 31 years ago, 15 new countries emerged from the rubble. These are Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia. Give me a second, let me get my breath. Okay, and then finally Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Despite the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia, the main state that remained, has pushed a policy that has kept these separatist states on their toes. That finally started proving to be a bad strategy when those countries started joining NATO. Russian aggression pushed them into the hands of the enemy. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined NATO in 2004, further scaring Putin as Russia became further and further isolated. To understand just how bad the NATO problem is for Russia, look at the screen for a moment. This is the Soviet Union in 1990. Russia dominated the Soviet Union and 6 allied Warsaw Pact countries, giving them significant influence over regional affairs. However, the NATO boogeyman has stripped that influence quite a bit. When it was formed, the alliance was part of an effort by the US and its European allies to deter any expansion of the then Soviet Union. Additionally, it was meant to reduce the possibility of conflict on the continent by encouraging greater political integration between its powers. In the decades since, it has steadily expanded its orbit, bringing a swath of Central and Eastern European states into its ranks after the Soviet Union collapsed. It is this very situation that has troubled Moscow. Over the last 3 decades, Germany was reunified and all the former Warsaw Pact countries have joined NATO. In addition, as I mentioned before, 3 countries that were once part of the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have joined NATO as well. This has reduced what was once a large area of influence for the Soviet Union to little more than domestic influence for Russia, the Soviet's successor state. Remember this map? Over the last decades, it has been reduced to this, a mere fraction of what it used to be. That's gotta be hard to take if you're trying to return to the glory days of the Soviet Union. The eastward expansion of NATO is what has caused a problem for Russia, as it keeps being limited in terms of its influence and power. Putin has objected to NATO expansion, saying in December of 2021, "America is at our doorstep with missiles." How would America feel if missiles are deployed at Canada or Mexico's
Hasos
borders?
and Chuchu.
This move by NATO to keep expanding right up to Russia's doorstep is what
That's
Russia does not want. And that very factor is what led Russia to invade Ukraine in the first place. As Ukraine's interest in becoming a NATO member increased, Russia realized that if that happened, they would be totally encircled, which is unacceptable to them. Ukraine, being the second biggest Soviet successor state, means that they have quite the influence, the resources, and the manpower. And for them to be a NATO member and be right at Russia's doorstep is unacceptable, and according to Russia, just plain wrong. So strongly is this ingrained in Russian thought that it has opted to go to war with Ukraine just to prevent them from becoming a NATO member state. Russia's approach has resulted in them having tense relations with the rest of Europe, particularly to NATO. This is resulting in some pretty tense and close confrontational encounters with NATO. Let's take a look at what Russia wants, or rather is demanding of NATO in these dire circumstances. Okay, now, hear me out on this one for a second. Putin is not wrong about how the alliance's growth has affected Russia's perception of its security. 30 years ago, Russia had a buffer zone of satellite states to the west. Now it only has the unimpressive presence of Belarus. Russia's western border is NATO's eastern flank. American and British military advisors serve in Ukraine. U.S. missile defense systems sit in Poland and Romania. And NATO troops conduct exercises in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, once part of the Soviet Union. If you ask Western officials, including the leaders of those new NATO countries, they all view those measures as purely defensive. After all, Putin is not really known for being the kind of leader who makes his neighbors comfortable. In response to all of these actions, Putin has outlined his grievances and demands. What Russia wants is for NATO to stop its expansion into Eastern Europe, close to Russia. In addition to this, Putin is demanding a guarantee from NATO that Ukraine would not have membership, a point he is adamant about. That's not all, however. Putin's list of demands continues. He wants NATO to retreat to pre-1997 status and stop the deployment of weapons in Russia's neighborhood. What Putin wants is tantamount to a smaller, weaker NATO, one that existed pre-1997. This is further supported by the fact that Russia has challenged the membership of 14 countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact.